Edward has taken the wind out of my sails somewhat, because I want to agree with everything he says. This is where the Lotteries Commission in recent times, in my opinion, have lost direction. They believe they've got the rights to numbers. Not only do they believe they've got the rights to numbers in South Africa, they believe they've got the right to dictate if a bookmaker takes the numbers from another jurisdiction where it's legitimately published and where that jurisdiction doesn't really care who uses the numbers. We've had a very similar case. There's legal precedent that went right up to our Constitutional Court, where bookmakers were offering a bet called a starting price bet. The starting price bet was a fixed odds where the payout could not be determined because the payout was going to be aligned to what the tote operator pays out. What the outcome eventually was at the Constitutional Court was that the panel of constitutional attorneys, when they deliberated and delivered their summation, said the following: as soon as the numbers, i.e. the outcome of the tote and the payout of the event, is published, albeit online, through the net, or in hard copy and hard press, anyone could do with it what they want. And what the bookmakers were doing was offering a second tier fixed odds bet based on the outcome of the tote. And what we're seeing here is exactly the same thing. You've got lotteries that offer pool bets. You can't win with one number. You can't win with two numbers. You're lucky if you get 6 Rand or 50 US cents on a 7 Rand 50 bet if you get 3 numbers. In a bookmaker's environment, in a fixed odds environment, you can take a fixed odds bet on one number. You probably get between 5.5 and 6 to 1. So you put $1 down or €1 down, you get back $5.50 or €5.50 or €6. Remember, you can't do that in a lottery environment in our country. Two numbers, you don't get paid out in the lottery, but you get 40 to 1 with a bookmaker. So if you've got 100 Rand down, you're getting 4,000 to 100. You won't see that at the lottery. 3 numbers, I've just told you, you're lucky if you get 6 Rand. If you're really lucky, you'll get 20 Rand back on your 3 Rand. In a bookmaking environment, it's 400 to 1. 400 to 1, ladies and gentlemen. So you put 1 Rand, you get 400 Rand. You put 10 Rand, you get 4,000. Lotteries, you don't get that. And yet they keep harping on the fact that they're in control of the numbers. And they need to, at some stage, be put on their place, because they have no right to dictate to the gambling boards at a provincial level, who have effectively regulated gambling for the past 100 years, but yet they insist they have. And I think it needs to be exposed for what it is, because it's absolutely ludicrous. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mike. Look, I think in some senses, you know, as attorneys in the industry, we feel the same way. I'd like to turn over to Taz. You know, the Taz and Lotto Star has been a prolific operator in South Africa for a number of years now, particularly in respect to the betting on lotteries and creative ways in which to also deal with that. I don't want to go into certain things which I think perhaps, unless you're comfortable, you know, to go into as far as the position that the National Lotteries Commission takes on these issues. But, you know, I suppose really this has presented a challenge to the market, and you guys have been at the forefront of that challenge. And really it's more your thoughts on the industry, the conflict that happens, and it's not just in South Africa, between bookmakers who are taking bets on the outcome of lotteries and lotteries. As I said, we've seen it in Tasmania now. We've seen it in Tasmania now. We've seen it in, I can't remember if it's Queensland or one of the other territories, despite it being licensed by the Northern Territories, and a number of regulators are actually trying to grapple with this issue. So I don't want to ask you any specific question other than to really get your thoughts on it.
So we trade as a bookmaker, and in our point of view, a bookmaker can take a bet on any contingency that we don't control. That's what our National Gaming Act says, and most of our provincial acts seem to align in that perspective. So contingency for us is something we do not control, and we take the bet and we manage the risk on that bet. What we have done is we creatively have taken what our bookmakers have been doing for years, and we just packaged it a different way, in the sense as the mechanics are exactly the same thing. You are placing a bet, but our point of sale, as if you want to call it, on which we are predominantly online, is obviously the feel and the look of actually placing a bet slip, choosing your numbers. So the feel and look, yes, it does feel like a lottery, but the mechanics is you're placing a bet. You get your bet slip has the payout table. The top lines are reinsured by insurance companies that are vetted by the gaming boards. We put up all the guarantees we need to, and this is something that has been happening in Europe for years. We're doing nothing new. We're just marketing it very well in South Africa, which has rattled a few cages, to the point where site bookmakers, I don't know if there's another bookmaker in here who can actually agree with me or not. This is bringing in, number betting in South Africa is 70%, up to 70% of a bookmaker's revenue.
Yes.
So because our return to player is far larger than the national lottery. And this is why our players are astute. They know this. They are aware of this. The other misconception is because it's online, we can't control it. I'm here to say that is not true. Everything is traceable. Our platform goes through vigorous testing by third parties as requested by the Gaming Board. Mpumalanga Gaming Board has ramped up its compliance teams, its audit teams, to actually regulate this online environment. I'm subjected to audits left, right, and center, and I actually understand why I am subjected to this. So from our perspective, we're taking a bet on an outcome we cannot control. Now, if it's random number generated results, or if it is ball results, that argument is all over the place. But now, apparently, last week, our national lotteries, Ituba, is now not doing ball lottery number, I don't know what it called, results. They've actually turned to random number generators. So that argument is out the pot as well. So it doesn't matter how computerized we're getting, that's the way things are going. And that is our take on it.
So, I'm going to pass this on to Andre as well, because what you've touched on is a very fundamental issue here. It strikes me that this is not necessarily per se a matter of law, even though there are legal challenges along the way which make us lawyers very happy, but but actually a question of that the rise of betting on the outcome of lotteries, as well as the newer Tier 1, Tier 2 insured type prize models, the so-called secondary lotteries, is presenting major competition for the national lotteries. Mm-hmm. Now, Andre, I'm not sure if in the research you've been doing, and I know this is just springing it on you, do you have any observations about the rise of secondary lotteries around the world? It's been absolutely prolific. We saw, binary options being the next sort of big thing, and CFDs, and that's kind of floated away somewhere. And the next thing that came up very strongly was secondary lotteries all over the world. Lottoland being one of them, who's made a real splash of things. There's a unique regulatory challenge, I suppose, here between the success of the national lottery in various countries, which does certain things and in principle promotes, you know, the common good and contributes to projects that governments can't really finance, and legitimate betting activity that is happening through other participants in the industry. Is this something we're seeing more and more of? Is there any way, in your view, one can resolve it?
No, it's all going to depend on the provisions in the particular jurisdiction's gaming legislation. I don't feel that I'm adequately informed to comment on the South African situation.
No, I'm asking more from an international
But from an international perspective and looking at what's being talked about, looking at it cold, the only comment I'll probably make that is of somewhat concern to me is the point that Tess has just made, that the outcome can't be controlled. As a former regulator, that concerns me, is that you offer a bet on an event, and that event cannot be controlled by you. My question is, who is controlling that? So you've got a third party who is running that event. It raises all sorts of questions. You can see where it goes.
Sure, but I mean, how different is it in betting on whether the
referee
or the Queen's hair is going to turn purple in 4 seconds' time to what the outcome is published on a newspaper or on television of a national lottery?
There is a difference. There is
a
slight difference. I mean, if you look at sports these days, integrity in sports is a big issue. And the leagues and the regulators are all talking to each other to make sure that the integrity of that event is not impacted in any way. And if it is, there's ways and means and agreements in place to make sure. It's a pity Nick isn't here, and he might want to comment on that. In this particular case, I'm not suggesting there is a problem. I'm just asking the question. It concerns me if you suggest that that event cannot be controlled, because in the end of the day, the question is it fair to the player that he's being allowed to bet on an event which is entirely outside your control? And let me just say, that is the reason why regulators around the world have started to not just look at the entity that faces the player directly. It's my point earlier. You've got to look at the third party who is involved in offering that event as well, and whether it's an associate or
yeah. So you look at, as you mentioned earlier, certification of each level or layer of the supply chain that has anything to do with the gambling transaction. You want to do?
Yeah. If I can just comment, I've been watching the questions coming up on the board. I think they're on the board behind us over there as well as in front of us. And I'm very interested to see, these questions have been coming up as the speakers have been speaking, and a lot of these questions have been answered, and it's interesting to see the type of confusion that still exists. The one question which actually, the first question there, if there are different license types existing, should licensees cannibalize each other's markets and bet types that they offer? It's a very interesting question from a universal perspective, and it goes to the previous panel where I think it was Nick that commented on the border between social games and gambling games becoming finer and finer and harder to define. But in essence, this border in just about all spheres of gambling is becoming finer and finer, because if you look at, for instance, a slot machine versus a Class 2 gaming machine, or what we call a limited payout machine or a pokey, these are separate licenses and distinct forms of gambling from a regulator's perspective, but from a punter's perspective, the machine looks exactly the same. Similarly, the bet type that is being offered by fixed odds, as a fixed odds bet by a bookmaker might look like a lottery, but it isn't. So, you know, I think this isn't unique to this particular debate as to whether it's a fixed odds bet on a lottery or whether it's actually a lottery itself. And it's interesting that these type of questions come up because it probably poses an interesting challenge to regulators in terms of how they define their license classes, how they issue such licenses. And then the second question tickled me because it came down to something Taz said about should other bookmakers be allowed to offer product equivalent to Lotto Star? Well, the answer is yes, and they can. And they do. And the only difference is that Taz is doing a particularly good job, or LOTTO are doing a particularly good job of marketing it in a unique way, and that's in essence why they've been targeted. But if they are being targeted, it's in the entire industry as well as the regulators, being the issuers of the bookmaker licenses, that are being scrutinized in that process. And I think Mike, in the very beginning, answered the third question. We're just clubbing all of these questions. I'm sure everyone will have an opportunity to pitch in. But when you bet on the outcome of a lottery, is the payout the actual lottery payout or another amount? The adverts are confusing. I'm not sure why, because certainly on the first two numbers, there's no competition as such. There's no payout. So it shouldn't be confusing. And there's fixed odds on the payouts. I think Mark went through them in great detail, 40-1 or whatever. And I think I've answered three of the questions. I'm going to give somebody else an opportunity.
Let me say the following, and I think I'd certainly like some comments in this regard. Is bearing on the one question about is the payout the same? Well, I think on the tier 1, tier 2 insured type lottery fixed odds bets, sometimes it can be bigger than what the national lottery is paying. And I think for me this is the crux of the matter, about the tension between bookmakers who are actually doing something interesting and competing, but not competing with the national lottery. They're competing on prize size. They're not competing in another way. Taz, you wanted to jump in?
Ironically, what has happened in the past couple of months is it has been said that the National Lotteries has a monopoly on numbers and everything, yes. But ironically, they've introduced new games based on fixed odds bets.
Yeah.
That are happening daily. So they have now come forward and seen there's something wrong with their system, and now they are competing with us, which is fantastic. I know some bookmakers have lodged cases against this, but at the end of the day, it's competition. On good causes, yes, the National Lottery is there for good causes. But the misconception again is the bookmakers, as per their license conditions, most of us have it in our license conditions to give back to good causes, and we are audited on this. I probably, and it's amazing, if the National Lottery has left a gap for us in the good cause department, then we are fulfilling our license conditions and our obligations. Yeah. It's not here's your license and here you go, and it's not let's go online and everyone's happy. We have to give back to good causes, a percentage. I think the Mpumalanga Gaming Board has imposed that on us from the beginning. Return to player is much higher. I think a national lottery has to return to player around 50%. The bookmakers are returning up to 80% of their bets. Our margins are much smaller than the National Lotteries Commission's margins. We are doing our part, and that is just forgotten about. It's like the bookmakers just making money and walking away with money. That isn't the case. To have our license, there are certain things we have to do, and you will testify to this.
No, absolutely.
Our gaming boards are tough on us.
No, absolutely, and I think any of the well-regulated jurisdictions, the gaming boards are tough, and there's a regulatory tension, if I can put it that way, where there's a huge amount of cooperation, but there's also a slight tension, and it's not an unhealthy tension necessarily; it's a necessary tension. From my perspective, what we're seeing around the world is that the rise of this is creating problems for national lotteries. The big issue is what does one do really from a regulatory perspective? One of the aspects, for example, because we live in a rather sophisticated world in certain ways, is can a state sponsor one state licensed activity in a way that skews the competitive playing fields for another duty licensed activity?
There's a question, an interesting question by, it's gone away now under the logo, but there was a question earlier about would the LOTTO argument, there we go. If a casino published the outcome of each roulette spin, could a bookmaker offer bets on this as per the LOTTO argument? And I think I'm going to let the panel comment rather than give my own thoughts right now.
No, I want to comment first, if I may. If the regulator allows it under other contingencies, then by all means you can. If the regulator allows it under other contingencies, then you can. Because if it's a legitimate spin, if the randomness of the roulette wheel has been tested and it's not tampered with, etc., then it's not anything untoward.
Let's say in a licensed casino. Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's say in a licensed
What's the difference?
No, I think I'm going to differ with Mike on this point. As I said, legislation, of importance to us as a regulator, is to ensure that there's certainty in the market. People invest huge sums of money based on what the rules of the game are. We cannot midstream start changing the categorization of licenses. If casinos are licensed to offer casino games, we cannot start allowing bookmakers to start offering casino games under the guise of fixed odds. So for a casino to start making its roulette available to a bookmaker, that transaction has to be approved first.
Sure.
And the approval will have to have regard to, is it allowed in terms of the framework? So you don't want to create uncertainty in the market by stretching lines and creating a very unclear waters. Then you're going to throw away the investment.
May I respond? Our regulator has spoken. The answer is no. Having said that, in a jurisdiction where an activity is also illegal, I think it would be inappropriate for a bookmaker to offer bets on something that is deemed illegal in the country where you reside and where you're taking the bets. Case in point, a couple of years ago, we had to look into dog racing. And after the investigation, our government took a decision that, based on the outcomes of the investigation, that they would not allow legalized dog racing in South Africa. And thus, they said, taking bets on dog racing from elsewhere in the world would undermine what we were seeking to do in our own country. Why would we allow our bookmakers to generate income from something that is deemed illegal in our country? And therefore they prevented it from happening. And here we're not talking dog racing in a virtual environment. We're talking televising dog racing as we would televise UK, North American, Canadian horse racing on an ongoing basis, and from Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. So those are the situations we also have.
There was just one last question about the EBTs masquerading as bingo, which again are these gaming machines, and I think we touched on that in both panels, and it's probably a fitting point to think about close to the end of the panel in terms of the lines again blurring between game types, between what games look like and what they actually are, and license types. But in the interest of time, I'll let Taz make a comment, and then we'll close.
No, open for the
As licensee holders, we'll always push to the limits. We are people that are driven. We obviously want to have the market, and we've been taught that we have to move with technology, we have to move with the time. Ironically, our government departments have to do the same, but they're a little bit slower than us. But saying that, we are totally aware where the line is drawn. So, for example, yes, I could make an argument we can take a bet on a roulette number. But that is making enemies where I don't want enemies. You know, there's certain things you can push, and there are holes to it. But do you want to be at loggerheads all the time? It's also a decision to be made. So I ironically agree with both parties. For example, we don't take bets on the national lotteries, our national lottery, because we don't want to compete with them. We've never wanted to, and we never will. And we've made certain decisions based around our country and also the gaming boards. You must understand, even if I'm licensed with Mpumalanga Gaming Board, we hold certain licenses with different boards, and most bookmakers do. And they can't isolate a gaming board just because they feel like going into war with them. The gaming boards stick together. I've got one license. There are bookmakers that have 150 licenses across the board. So we do know where the line, the push is.
Yeah, we're not so good at not pushing as lawyers. I certainly could make some good arguments as to why roulette should be bet on pretty much any other contingency. Nonetheless, questions from the floor, because we're going to start heading towards wrapping up. It's the end of the conference. Unless Edward has got anything to say, I'd like to thank the panelists here and call on Mr. Fuga, our esteemed president, to make some remarks.
Well, I'd like to thank Wayne and Garen for moderating the sessions this morning, and to all the panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. It certainly has flown by this morning. It's actually the 2.5 days have flown by since we first opened the conference Tuesday morning and are closing it now. It's been great. I really appreciate everyone here. I hope to see everyone in Copenhagen in September next year. And if anybody has any thoughts or suggestions for topics that they'd like to hear, ones from here that were started and continuing the discussions next fall, please let us know. Thank you.
I'll set up your role for the people. I used to do it overseas.
Mama